Hey, let's do some more React. In this video, we're going to talk about click events and how to use those, and we'll show how you can change state with those. That's basically all we're going to cover at this point. We have a new project. It looks like all the other projects. I've created a blank project with Create React App. It's going, and we're ready to go now as well. So let's go to the app and put all of our content in this section. Okay, so we have an app. Let's create some state. First thing I want to do is build a counter. Meaning I want to build a component where, well, I'm going to just change this component actually. I want to have a variable that holds a number. When I click on a button, I want to increment that number. Something fairly simple. So super this dot state equals number. To review, whenever you create a constructor for a component in React, you need to remember to always call the super method before you ever use this keyword in it. And then in the constructor, you can set up state this way, where you just assign an object to the state property, like so. After that, all state updates need to be made with the setState method. We'll do that in a second. So we have created a variable here. Let's create a button. So here's a button. Whenever I click on this, I want to increment the value by 1. Well, you know, I should probably show the value. All right, let's see what that looks like. So the value is 0. I want to click this and increment the value. Well, 2 steps to this. First, I need to set up an action for this to call. So I'm going to create a function here, and I'm going to say increment by 1. That's the name of my function. And in this, step 2, I need to actually put my functionality, this dot set state, and I need to take the current state number and increment it by 1. So I can say number is now going to be this dot state dot number plus 1. So how do I hook this guy up to this guy? Well, there's a few different ways to do it. I'll show you all of the ones that I've seen. So here we go. We have an OnClick attribute. What this does here is this is the React way of hooking up a function call to a click event on an element. And so I will create that. So OnClick equals curly brackets, and in here let's create an arrow function and call this dot increment by 1, and you do need the parentheses here. So let's see if this works. Yay, that works. So every time I click on the button, it calls this arrow function, and when it calls this arrow function, it then calls that function right there. All right, so that's one way to do it. Let's create another button. In this button, I want to increment by 5. Same, let's see, let's do this a little bit different. If we'd like to avoid having to use the arrow functions at this point, I'm going to show you a couple ways of doing it. So I need to define a function called increment by 5, and here I'm going to set state and then say number, this dot state dot number plus 5. See how well this works. increment by 1, increment by 5. Excellent. So how does this work? Well, whenever we click on the button, it's going to call this. You can see that I just gave it the function itself. I didn't wrap it in an arrow function. That's what this is doing. This is wrapping the function call in an arrow function, and that is to make sure that this reference is correct. In this particular case, I don't do that, and I can do that, and it works fine because this right here is another arrow function. And what this will do is this will make sure that the this in here is the right thing. And then we assign this arrow function to increment by 5 so that we can down here call it. Okay, so you're still using an arrow function in both cases to make sure that this variable or this property is working. And that's why you use arrow functions. At the very end, I'll show you an example of what happens when you don't use an arrow function. So that's another method. Now let's create a decrement method. And here's another way that will allow you to hook these up without doing an inline arrow function. So this function will decrement the value by 1. So how are we going to do that? So here's our UI. Of course, it doesn't work. Let's create this function, decrement by 1. And now in the constructor, what I need to do is I need to bind this function to the proper this context, which would be this instance of the component. I can do this by doing this right here. So what this is doing, okay, let's try to stop saying that word when I don't need to. What that bit of code right there is doing is it is taking the current value of this and binding it to this to that function right there, and then reassigning that bound function and essentially replacing the original. So I'm replacing the original function with a bound function pointing to the proper instance of this component, and so therefore this should work. All right, I'm using it there, so let's decrement. Oh, no, I did something wrong. You know what I did is I forgot to save the file. See the blue there? Well, try this again. Okay, now it works. Okay, so to repeat what is going on here is I defined a function called decrement by 1. I'm taking that function right there and I'm binding whenever the component is created or instantiated. I am taking that function and I'm binding the current this reference, which is the correct one, to that function, and then replacing the original function with the bound function that will come out of this function right there. Okay, and so decrement by 1, that is why that works. We actually saw, because I forgot to save the file, what happens when you don't use the proper this context. And let's go and reproduce that. Okay. So what's going to happen is whenever I click on this button, it will attempt to fire this. However, the this will not actually be quite correct. So let's do it. There we go. Cannot read property set state of null. So this is null within this function. And I can't call set state on null because null doesn't have that function. That is a function that is built into React components. And so if I don't make sure that the this context is correct, then bad things happen. Specifically, that problem right there will happen. And so I showed you 3 ways of solving this. One is to wrap all your calls in arrow functions. Way 2 is this increment by 5, is to use an arrow function when defining the function in the first place. And this will bind the correct context to the this. And finally, you can actually use the bind function, this right here, this bind function, to bind the this context to the correct one here in the constructor. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind click events. You can obviously do anything with them. This is just calling a few functions. That is the basic idea. You call functions and then you do whatever you want to do. And so that's the idea. And these are some different techniques for doing this. You can technically go any one of these ways. Well, not this last one. That one didn't work. Other than the last, you can go any one of those ways, and they should work just fine for you. In the next video, I'll show you some more examples, or at least one more example of how to use OnClick. And so if you need more, you'll see that in the next video where I'm going to talk about input values, like the input tag, and how to get things out of that and build what are called controlled components in React.